What if I told you that right now, here in the UK, there are literally dozens of convicted criminals running around calling themselves journalists whilst harassing women, pensioners, and the most vulnerable in society? And what if I then told you that this was being monetised on a large scale whilst also significantly shifting public discourse? And what if I then said that this shift in modern journalism didn't just come from technology, but from when trust collapses? Because when people stop believing and trusting institutions, the solution isn't always better information sources, it's louder voices. However, these people calling themselves citizen journalists aren't filling a gap left by the mainstream media, they're exploiting it. This is the dark rise of citizen journalism, the grift and the curse. I want to be clear from the very start. This video is not about silencing people, and it's not about defending the mainstream media. And it's also not saying that ordinary people shouldn't document what they see.
The fact is, Robert, it was my driver's idea. He very much started grifting.
When institutions fail, people don't stop looking for information, they just stop believing the usual sources. And that creates a vacuum. And in that vacuum, something else grows. Now, in the UK, this space has been filled by a loose, chaotic ecosystem calling itself citizen journalism. And it's an ecosystem that now plays a significant role in shaping public opinions around protests, policing, migration, and social breakdown. Now, while some of it is legitimate to a degree, a lot of it is reckless, and some of it, when you look closely, is deeply troubling. All right, first of all, we need a little bit of history.
This is London Calling. Here is the news read by Derek Baker.
Now, when we go back and we look at the earliest days of mass media, in the very beginning, this develops alongside power. Now, that power is political, that power is economic, and that power is very much steeped in empire.
The foundations began on the lands of England, with a powerful British monarchy igniting an extraordinary story of exploration and world domination.
Now, in its earliest forms, information didn't circulate freely, it flowed from the top down, from the kings to the royal courts, and through the ruling classes of the day. Now, news then existed simply to serve authority, not to challenge it in any way.
He also unified Ireland during his reign. Henry VIII was known for his obesity and ill health in his later years.
Now, as trade expanded and technology improves, journalism evolves with it. The gathering and transmission of news becomes more regular, more structured, and more widespread, because people wanted to know what was going on around them. Now, experts would call this period a steady expansion, because what you've got is you've got more information, it's moving faster, and it's getting to more people. By the 1700s, newspapers had become the primary medium of journalism in the UK. Magazines then follow around the 18th century, and by the 20th century, you've got radio and television. I could dedicate an entire video to each of these sections alone, and many people have across the internet. But for most of the 20th century, it's fair to say that mass media was relatively easy to define. And then in the post-war period, coinciding with the explosion of youth culture, media is commonly and clearly defined into particular industries, with some overlap. So you've got books, you've got magazines, you've got newspapers, radio, television, cinema, and recorded media. However, this clarity is not going to last. The digital explosion of the late 1990s and early 2000s shatters these boundaries. And by the 21st century, the internet has transformed everything. Now, with the arrival of the internet and further down the line, smartphones, what happens is there is a collapse in how media is produced, distributed, and consumed, and it's all been collapsed essentially into single devices. Now, anyone can publish, anyone can broadcast, anyone can shape a narrative. But what's very important to understand is long before this digital shift has fully arrived, traditional media has already learned something critical. What they'd figured out is that outrage and fear sold. They also figured out that headlines become weapons, that stories are spectacles, and moral panic massively fits into their business model. Tabloids had perfected this formula to an art, and with that comes immense influence. And we've seen this influence abused time and time again right across the spectrum, from political scandals, industrial disputes, to catastrophic failures of reporting, where lies were repeated, defended, and protected for years.
A further 92 complaints about officers' actions have been upheld, or there is a case to answer for misconduct.
And what you kind of have is you've got these media empires personified by the likes of Rupert Murdoch, which have essentially long shaped and still shape huge parts of public discourse and opinion. A tabloid like the Daily Mail, which is the most read in the UK, is owned by the grandson of a man who openly admired fascism a century ago. I think this tells us a lot of what we already know. So look, when I say that trust in mainstream media wasn't lost overnight, I absolutely fucking mean it. It was eroded, headline by headline, scandal by scandal.
Is that the Mail on Sunday ran an article, February 2007, saying that my relationship with my then girlfriend, Jemima Khan, was on the rocks.
And then eventually what we're left with is large sections of the public just not believing whatever they're told. And when that trust collapses, along comes a vacuum. And as you know, a vacuum never stays empty for long. And that's where we have what we now call citizen journalists starting to enter the picture. However, before we get to that point, it's important to understand what changed in the early mid to 2010s to create the fertile ground for what we have today. Throughout the early 2010s, a wave of digital-first news outlets start to emerge. Now these guys are professional and they are born online. So you've got sites like the Huffington Post, BuzzFeed News. One of my favourites from back then was Vice. You've got sites like Mashable, Business Insider, The Canary, and we even see The Independent shift to an online-first model when it comes to them getting their news out. Now what happens here is these platforms normalise a crucial idea. And that idea is that journalism no longer needs to come from print presses or broadcast studios, it can come from anywhere. And what matters is the speed more than the depth. The ability to share matters more than the context, and opinion is increasingly sat alongside reporting. An audience are then trained to consume news through their social feeds, not just front pages. And then what we also start to see alongside this is some explicitly ideological platforms. So for example, Rebel News, I mentioned The Canary, Novara Media, Spiked, the Guido Fawkes blog. Now these outlets at this stage are not even pretending to be neutral. They embraced political framing openly. They rejected traditional idea of objectivity. They built loyal identity-based audiences, and the bias wasn't hidden anymore. It was branded. So again, you've got a situation where the barrier of entry is collapsing even further. There are platforms like Medium, WordPress blogs. Later you've got Substack. And this means that you no longer need an editor, a newsroom, legal oversight to reach millions. You can do most of it in-house yourself with small teams and speak directly to your audience. And this was the real shift. And what changed in the 2010s isn't just who published the news, it was who decided what counted as the news. The traditional gatekeepers have disappeared, the audiences have become algorithms, and attention has become the currency. You're probably thinking, why does any of this matter? I thought I was going to watch a video about questionable geezers and geezettes shoving cameras in people's faces and shouting about boats.
Stop touching him.
I just do my job. I just do my job.
So put your badge the right way.
Stop the boats, stop the boats. If you spoke to any reformer as to why were they voting reform, it was to stop the boats.
And yeah, that is what this video is essentially about. But to understand it, you have to understand the ecosystem that legitimizes the idea of outside journalism. As I said, it trains audiences to distrust legacy media, and it turned "I'm not mainstream" into a direct selling point. And this directly sets the conditions for auditors, protest streamers, migrant hunters, and confrontation first content. Because once journalism becomes something you perform rather than something that is practiced, the loudest voices do not need to be the most accurate. They just need to be the most clickable. Now, of course, it's really important to not overlook the part that technology plays in this, but essentially what technology has done, it's filled in the blanks. It's done the rest. So you've got cheaper cameras, smartphones, free editing software, and most importantly, you have instant distribution through social media channels. It essentially means that anybody with a phone can publish at any time. And during COVID, we saw this accelerate dramatically.
Hundreds of people took to the streets of central London Saturday to protest the new restrictions aimed at curbing the spread of the coronavirus.
And again, what we're seeing is everybody becoming a broadcaster. And with that comes the incentive. Views become money, outrage becomes reach, and conflict becomes content. And what we begin to see isn't documentation, as I've already alluded to, it's performance. Right, now we're going to kind of start to drill down a bit more into the specifics, and this is where things start to become more and more uncomfortable as we go on. According to analysis by organisations such as Hate Not Hope, Novara Media, Searchlight UK, and an excellent Facebook group called UK tyrant hunters, what we're seeing today didn't appear out of nowhere. It evolved. And long before the individuals now describing themselves as journalists, many were operating in different spaces entirely. You had migrant hunters, so-called paedophile hunters.
Yeah, but I'm not a criminal.
And then you had street vigilantes filming confrontation for social media. So by the time you get to the citizen journalism of today, there's a format that's already being established. And it essentially goes, go to a location, identify a target, provoke a confrontation, film the fallout, monetize the reaction. And over time, this model just gets tweaked and rebranded. You know, what you really see is hunting becoming exposing, and harassment becoming accountability, and provocation becoming journalism. And crucially, the subject matter is fluid and able to shift from individuals to institutions to migrants to protest movements. Again, Hate Not Hope reporting highlights how many figures now operating as auditors and street reporters have backgrounds in all of these earlier vigilante spaces. And this matters because it explains the tone. This isn't neutral observation, it's confrontation by design, with a formula that's been proven to work time and time again. The camera's not there to witness events, the camera's there to trigger them. And then, post-2024 Southport riots and protests begin to spring up all over the UK around migrant hotels, this ecosystem finds a perfect storm.
Fuck the immigrants!
So by the time 2025 rolls around, this ecosystem has not only been tweaked to perfection, but it finds its perfect subject. And what we see is not coverage, it's absolute saturation. You could not turn on your social media or even the mainstream news without seeing a protest at a hotel. But what is really key to understand, and I experienced this myself, as did other people. I know Gary Stevenson of Gary's Economics said that there was actually one happening near where he lived, and he went to observe it. And what he observed, that many of us observed when we attended these protests, is whilst there was a number of concerned citizens, in many cases, the citizen journalists outnumbered the protesters. And what you start to understand, that this isn't about a few large creators, it's hundreds, as I've said, quite possibly hundreds of smaller ones, each feeding the algorithm, each reinforcing the same frames, and each pushing content into different corners of social media. It's a decentralized propaganda machine. All right, look, how does this come to me? Why am I doing this video? Well, like most people, prior to the hotel protest explosion of 2025, I was vaguely aware of auditors. I'd heard of Cycling Mikey. I'd seen some of these faceless guys harassing people in their jobs, security guards, police officers, things of that nature. They kind of existed somewhere on the edge of my feed, part of the background noise of the internet. They were easy to ignore, they were easy to scroll past, and for the most part, that's what most of us did. But as I say, summer 2025 changes absolutely everything. So this really starts to come close to home for me, and against the backdrop of an anti-migrant hotel protest literally 5 minutes from my door, and they were protests that I opposed openly because frankly they were steeped in racism and Islamophobia, but I had my first interaction with an auditor through this, and he goes by the name of Virus Geezer.
Daily Express have reported that 2 small boats have arrived in the UK.
Why are we seeing asylum seeker males being separated from the asylum seeker family? This is just making people more angry. One person loses their life, that will be it. I don't want that to happen. No one wants that to happen.
Now, I first encountered him when, unbeknown to me, he was secretly filming me at a council protest I attended regarding the aforementioned protests. Now, at the time, I had no idea who he was. He then come to my attention, and what followed was what I would later discover was a familiar pattern for many people. First, there was a half-hearted attempt to dox me, to which I responded by jumping into his live stream and confronting him. That confrontation then leads to him agreeing to have a debate with me, whilst also backtracking on some of his nefarious behaviour around doxing. Then what happens, we have a debate, and what becomes apparent is that when challenged with facts rather than fear, completely collapses. And it's something that you see time and time again with auditors. When they're met with reciprocal energy and evidence, they fold. It's only when they're speaking to their own audience do they revert to type, with the same slogans, the same vague references to protecting women, protecting children, and something about free speech. And the free speech is hilarious because their definition of free speech seems to also extend to harassing and abusing people for their content. Now, Virus, whose real name is Paul Judd, is a pretty typical example of these types. He's loud, he's intentionally misinforming people, particularly around migrants and Muslims, and Eventually, it catches up with him. In 2025, outside a hotel in Canary Wharf, he was arrested on suspicion of racially aggravated harassment, and I believe he's currently awaiting trial. As part of his bail conditions, he's prohibited from attending gatherings of more than 3 people, which he hilariously tried to have overturned so he could attend the Unite the Kingdom protest in September. And since then, he cuts a bit of a sad figure, creating fake beef online for clicks and gifts on TikTok while sitting in the pub, live streaming, soliciting money from his followers, and continuing to post content that rarely survives even basic fact checking. And again, this is all part of an emerging and continuous pattern, because over the summer, as counter-protests form against the racism aimed at migrant hotels, a small group of us begin to notice something unsettling. The same faces keep appearing, and then when you look closer, the pictures just get darker and darker.
Behaviour I do not know, kind of a little bit crazy, but fancy coming up to a member of the public and just taking their phone.
Now, one particularly dark example, believe me, there are many, involves an individual called Anthony Styles. Now, he's known online across his YouTube and Facebook as AJ Audits, and in August 2025, he appeared in the crowd at the Stanwell Hotel protests, aiming a camera at the hotel and the crowd with children in it, advocating for the protection of said children and women. But what he wasn't so vocal about was his previous conviction for child sexual abuse, including the rape of a 14-year-old girl when he was 51 years of age. That's right, Save Our Kids, Anthony Styles is a convicted sentence offender found guilty of sexual offences against children. Now, what's really interesting is when this became known amongst the local protest group, they distanced themselves immediately, but the very same people who showed endless aggression towards so-called fighting age men in hotels who'd actually committed no crimes showed none of the same energy when confronted with an actual convicted offender in their midst. They just wanted to distance themselves from it. And the contradiction is absolutely telling. And again, we dig and we dig and we find out more and we find out more. And it doesn't actually take a lot. But one thing that is absolutely impossible to ignore is that because of the highly confrontational style that these so-called journalists adopt, it is inevitable that escalation will occur at some point. And counter-protesters routinely report being subjected to abuse, often vile, often personal, and overwhelmingly aimed at women and the vulnerable. Another example I want to give you is somebody called Marty Blagborough.
We're back here with the feed Leeds outreach.
Take Marty Blagborough, a Leeds-based activist with a history of convictions, including threatening staff at a COVID vaccination centre in 2021, as well as being involved in multiple alterations through his journalism. He has allegedly harassed and doxed pro-Palestinian campaigners, often whilst intoxicated, and he regularly attends anti-migrant demonstrations where he incites confrontations and spreads racist falsehoods. And during my research, I've uncovered that Blagborough has over 30 convictions, many including violence. In one particularly disturbing case, he orchestrated a sustained campaign against a female protester, both online and in real life, and this resulted in a court order banning him from attending protests altogether. Whilst Blagborough portrays himself as someone who not only reports what the mainstream media doesn't, he also says he feeds the homeless through a charity of his and crowdfunding from his supporters. However, during this research for this, it's come to light that Blagborough will often raid waste bins at supermarkets, feed the people, and use the money raised from his supporters to frequent his favourite holiday destinations, usually Mallorca and Benidorm, multiple times a year.
Just approaching 5 a.m. In fact, it's just past 5 a.m. We've got about 20 minutes till we start boarding. Just having a cup of tea.
So look, by the end of 2025, this whole thing is feeling relentless. There is not a single protest or even a quiet news day without a cluster of citizen journalists filming, live streaming, provoking. It is relentless. And the result is exactly the same. It's a constant flow of content pushing the same narrative. Migrants are criminals, migrants are threats, and migrants are dangers to women. Primarily carried out by individuals who are criminals, who are threats, and who are danger to women. Now, it's all overwhelmingly delivered by men, but that shouldn't play down the role that women play in this ecosystem. Whilst the hotel protests are going on, you have other figures such as Charlie Veitch, who's probably one of the most known street journalists. He's operating elsewhere across the Northwest, harassing teenagers and vulnerable people, many of whom have struggled with addiction or mental health issues. But in early 2026, Charlie Veitch was banned from Manchester for his continued provocation of vulnerable people in society. But that doesn't stop him moving around the country and continuing his quest to make money off the misery of other people whilst masquerading as a journalist. And honestly, I could make multiple hour videos on each of the individuals that get mentioned. There's Bear Britain Audits, happy to call white ethno-nationalists his bro, whilst also claiming, I'm not racist, but DP audits, AY audits, the Scrap Man, Jackson Media, English Ned. I could literally go on forever. But there is another case that is also incredibly disturbing and weirdly stands apart. There's something very sinister about this case, and the more we looked into it, the more we found that. And that's the case of Curtis Arnold, the man behind DJE Media.
Few creators divide opinion like Curtis Arnold, the man behind DJE Media. To his 250,000 subscribers, he's a raw, unfiltered documentarian. To his critics, he's a calculated provocateur who targets the vulnerable.
Now, Curtis Arnold is a convicted sex offender currently subject to a 10-year sexual harm prevention order. That's because in 2019, Arnold pleaded guilty to multiple offences, including voyeurism, causing sexual activity without consent, and making indecent images of a child. Court reporting describes an elaborate deception in which he posed as a sportswear executive to lure women and teenage girls into gyms and then secretly filming them. Despite this, Arnold has continued to operate as an auditor or independent journalist, filming members of the public across the UK. And as of early 2026, he's monitored by police for potential breaches of his restrictions, but it still leaves a very sour taste in the mouth that this man is out in public with a camera, filming without restriction, it would appear. And that alone should give us all cause for concern. Now look, I just want to pause for a second on the auditors. I guess consider this a little bit of a honourable mention, and I could do individual videos on both of the examples that I'm gonna talk on next, and one of them I think I actually will do an entire video on. And this phenomenon isn't limited to people who call themselves auditors. Alongside and often overlapping are figures like Jodie Scott, otherwise known as Mrs. Ken. She's a singer who rose to prominence after the United Kingdom rally, pushing her own brand of misinformation, fear-mongering and grievance politics, often wrapped in the language of women's safety, encapsulated by a god-awful and, quite frankly, confusing song. Keir Starmer, the granny harmer, once was mixed up in Israel drama. Keir Starmer, the granny harmer. Scott was later exposed as part of a WhatsApp group that openly advocated violence against minorities, and in particular Muslims. And when confronted about this, she tried to blame it on the offenders being severely autistic and they had kicked them from the group. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up, because she technically isn't an auditor, but the reason that this matters is because the role women play in the modern far-right ecosystem is not accidental. It's actually very strategic. Because these spaces are overwhelmingly male. They're aggressive, they're confrontational, and they're often hostile. So when women are placed front and centre, shouting about safety and protection, it gives these movements a veneer of legitimacy that would otherwise struggle to achieve. And as in the case of Scott, the mask does eventually slip. But it serves to soften the optics, it blunts the criticism, and it allows groups of angry men to say, look, women are saying it too. But again, this framing collapses the minute you look at the reality, because women are not being protected in these spaces, they're being used. And time again, women are positioned as emotional shields, their presence deployed to launder extremist talking points into something that looks like concern rather than hostility. But the bitter irony is this: the very groups these women stand shoulder to shoulder with are statistically the greatest risk to them. And this isn't rhetoric, this is borne out in data. Of those arrested during the 2024 migrant hotel riots, 42% had previous convictions for domestic violence. Let that sink in. Nearly half of the men arrested for so-called protective protests already had histories of abusing women behind closed doors. So when these movements scream about safety, they're not amplifying protection, they're helping sanitize danger. And once again, this pattern holds. The language is emotional, the imagery is powerful, the facts are inconvenient. But just like the auditors, just like the live streamers, just like the entire grift, the performance comes first and the truth comes last. And as I say, the people most at risk are always the ones standing closest to the fire. There are many other examples that I can touch on the auditors, and I'm going to do an entire video on these guys. So I'll briefly kind of just mention them in the context of it, because it is the same behavior, just dressed in different uniforms. A great example, raise the colours.
From the left and the police, we are desperate to put our plan into action and to stop the illegal invasion of our home. So we do not want any further delays. So I'm going to tell you now that this is your call for help. The next 24 hours, everyone that's emailed offering to help us is going to be contacted with an email back from us with the next steps.
So you've got these football lads who fancy themselves as England's defenders, failed activists reinventing themselves as fake war correspondents, essentially all hidden behind a grift to raise £250,000 and calling itself Operation Overlord. I will make a full video on Raise the Colours, but I'll leave you with this gem just for the moment.
We've all got to come together and let's together stop the boats.
Now, anyone who watches my TikTok live streams knows I have not held back. I've called these people out time and time again. I've argued with them. I've had them come up on the live stream from Stop the Boats Media.
Excuse me, you got any Christmas trees?
Yeah. What size are you looking for?
Well, they don't say Christmas tree on them, so I'm a bit confused.
Yeah, they are Christmas trees.
They don't say Christmas tree.
Yeah, they are Christmas trees.
No, that's not a Christmas tree. Do you know who it was that made the decision? Because that's obviously done by George.
I'm happy to open discussions with them, but when they're challenged, it's just the same response. It's what we've been told, a bingo card of concerns, and then when you dig a little bit deeper, you understand who these people are. This particular individual, despite having a major issue with Christmas trees, when you dig a little bit deeper, you understand that he had heavy involvement with the now defunct EDL, has a habit of door-stopping people for the crime of removing flags, and despite coming across as reachable and willing to open his mind, it never lasts because the pull of the grift continues to be too strong. And look, I could give you individual after individual, and time again, you see the same patterns. And the end goal is always the same: financial gain disguised as legitimate concern. And then that kind of really brings us to what the motive of all of this is. The common thread that runs through it is money. These auditors know exactly what enrages and what engages their audience. So they make content that racks up thousands, sometimes millions of views. And with those views, they get revenue, they get donations, and they get influence. Now listen, I'm not against enterprise in any way. But when profit comes at the expense of truth, and when narratives are being driven by people with histories of violence, abuse and misogyny, as well as racism, homophobia and Islamophobia, you start to understand this is not just an internet problem, it's a social one. Because people are too easily swayed by what they're reportedly told. And that plays perfectly into the hands of politicians who benefit from the division. This isn't accidental, it's profitable. And that brings us to the final boss of the grift.
This is targeting me, and you see all the citizen journalists here. If they're successful today, never bring your mobile phone.
Now listen, this isn't yet another video on Tommy 10 names, the stooge mentioned in the Epstein files. But it's a very important thing to understand that the average auditor on the street, the Raise the Colours crew, Jodie Scott, and all those described here today, they see TR as their hero and demigod.
Support any independent journalist, any citizen journalist, get behind them, because there's a war coming. It's the media against citizen journalists.
Now Robertson didn't invent the collapse in trust in institutions, but he perfected how to exploit it. He turned the mechanics of distrust into a business model long before today's decentralised audit culture even existed. Now, as we know, he rose from far-right street organising, co-founding the English Defence League in 2009, into a media figure who tours protests, live streams confrontations, and reframes legal trouble as his own individual persecution. And here's how that playbook works out. Live stream from outside a court or a protest, not providing any context, but to provoke and dramatise. Confrontational filming turned into a spectacle with an audience. Arrests and court cases turned into proof that the system hates me and you. Followers were taught to believe that anyone else is lying except the guys with the cameras. Now, his most notorious example was live streaming outside a Leeds Crown Court sexual abuse trial, breaching reporting restrictions. Rather than stepping back, he doubled down. He presented his sentence for this crime as proof the establishment was trying to silence him and prompting rallies and protests around his name. He also lied about a Syrian schoolboy, resulting in a libel case which he lost, which in turn led to his imprisonment for contempt of court. This is turned again into another round of donations to help the silenced martyr from his rabid supporters who will donate at any given moment. And this moment's not just a legal footnote, it's the origin story of the modern, performative, confrontation style we see repeated everywhere today. His content isn't journalism, it's street theatre designed to trigger reactions and build a brand, and has been from the beginning. And they all monetize it exactly the same way. Donations from their followers, video views, paid interactions and exclusive content, paid consultancy and appearances feeding into broader far-right ecosystems in the case of Robinson. And ultimately, he's now seen by the establishment as a direct line into the disenfranchised white working class, the very people they endeavour to fuck over while simultaneously weaponising them to go against their own needs and interests. Why? Shakira law, Muslimics, Brexit, culture. I don't fucking know. But what matters here is the template that he sets. Define yourself as an outsider to the lying mainstream, turn conflict into content, frame legal consequences as persecution, and monetize attention and outrage. And because of this template, today's decentralized auditors aren't innovators. They're simply replicating Robinson's playbook, just on smaller platforms with less polish and often more chaos. You place a camera in someone's face, provoke them, film the fallout, and sell the narrative. That's the modern citizen grifter model, and it tracks straight back to Tommy 10 names. So look, what's the conclusion to this? I want to be absolutely clear. Citizen recordings can and often are incredibly powerful. They are vital. They expose truths that institutions would rather hide. If members of the public hadn't filmed Rodney King, we would never have known that black people in LA were getting beaten for many, many years. We might never have seen George Floyd murdered in broad daylight by a police officer, sparking the Black Lives Matter movement. Just recently, we watched footage of an ICE agent killing an innocent woman, then an innocent man in a separate incident, neither of which are captured by a newsroom, but they're captured by people nearby. And much of what the world knows about the genocide in Gaza has not come from embedded reporters or journalists, it's come from first-hand footage filmed on people's phones. These are not staged confrontations. These are not manufactured content. These were not provoked. These are genuine people documenting reality as it unfolds. These people are the real citizen journalists. But what we're talking about in this video has been something else. A performance economy, a content farm, and a system that rewards escalation, outrage, and misinformation while hiding behind the language of truth. When journalism fails, people stop searching for answers, but when grifters fill that space, people don't get informed, they get mobilized, and the consequences do not stay online, they spill into the streets. And that's the difference, and that's why it matters. Now, what we do about this, I think, is very much down to us. I think we need to call it out, I think we need to confront it where safe, and I think we never need to let up, and we should always go looking for the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments your thoughts on citizen journalism, your experiences with citizen journalists, and make sure you join me back here next time on another episode of Tizz Talks. Peace out.